if you believe in Torah and you believe this is the truth, you should be confident enough to believe that what's called a marketplace of ideas,
it will win.
It can fend for itself.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't need protected. It doesn't need to be sugar-coated. What happens when you go ahead and you take something in Torah, and this happens all the time, right? There's an idea in Torah, and you look around you, what the common wisdom is, what everyone thinks the truth is, and it's completely against it, right? So you want to make it fit. You know what's going to happen in another 20 years? People are going to say, Torah said this. That's so old-fashioned. That's so 2020s.
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2023. My name is Bentzi, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, so I'm here tonight with Yanki Tauber, who is the editor and writer and founder of OpenBook Torah, or OpenBook Press.
OpenBook Press is
OpenBook Press, who
the publisher. OpenBook Torah is the book.
OpenBook Press that published OpenBook Torah, and of course I've read much of what Yanki, or a lot of that Yanki has written over the years. As a Bach in Yeshiva, there are many times that I read his adaptations of the Sichas online and in print, and I really got to know Yanki a couple months ago when I was asked by Yanki and his co-founder Baruch Gorkin to make a film about their new Chumash, which was truly a unique experience on many levels, mainly because it's not every day that I get to work with people who are so dedicated and so particular in their craft. And it was a chance to really learn from people who had put many, many years into this project and really treated every detail with immense care. And it made for a longer edit than usual and a longer process than usual, but it was truly a special learning experience. And as I started this podcast, I thought it would be great to have Yanki on. I asked him on earlier on. What's that? The bell?
No, that's a clock.
All right, I gotta get out more. Yeah. All right. So I asked Yanki onto the podcast at the beginning. It didn't work out, but here we are. We're still in the middle of Chumash Bereshis, so we still got a few weeks left, and I'm glad that we finally had the chance to sit down. We were talking earlier off camera about the idea of living with contradictions, and how the Rebbe would speak about how the Jewish calendar is both tries to absorb and does absorb both the solar cycle and the lunar cycle, and how even though that ends up in essentially being irreconcilable and just and a constant struggle and a constant tension that never gets fully reconciled, that's just part of life. You got to live with a contradiction. And I think even though that was off camera, I think that very much sets the tone for this conversation, because that's very much the idea of the Chumash, as you explained to me then, creating a book where people can figure out their own contradictions and figure out their own resolutions, or maybe just live with the contradictions. So right. I would like to get there, but first I would like to start with how we got to your thinking about a Chumash and how you got to thinking about presenting it this way. So I think we need to go back a little bit to your own history and find out how this young boy from Crown Heights learned how to write full sentences.
Okay, that's the biggest mystery of them all.
Yes, sir.
A lot of people ask me that question, and Olei Torah tried to turn me into the poster child for Olei Torah, to say that you can go to Olei Torah and still know how to write, but
you don't buy it.
I don't buy it. People ask me how I learned, and I don't really have the answer to that. Just by trying and having some very, very good people help me out along the line. I had some very good editors and advisors, and It really boils down to just sort of convincing yourself and deluding yourself, for lack of a better word, that you can do it.
Yeah, but what brought you, like, describe a little bit the Crown Heights you grew up in, because there weren't too many people that ended up doing what you did. So describe a little bit the Crown Heights, the milieu that you grew up in. When did you first start thinking about writing? Was it something, did you like reading a lot?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I always loved reading, and I always greatly admired writers. I would say by the time I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, I was reading anything I can get my hands on in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. I had come from, my grandfather who wrote under the pen name Zvi Yair. Zvi Meir Steinmetz was his name. He was a Hebrew poet. He was very much a literary person. He spoke 9 or 10 languages fluently. He actually wrote poetry in a number of them, edited the newspapers in languages that he only learned a few months before. I mean, he had a very...
Where was this? Back in Russia or here in America?
Well, no, he was never any... Well, he was born in an area that today might be Russia. Right. But unlike many people equate Lubavitch with Russia, but he's not from Russia. No,
he was a Lubavitcher?
He was a Lubavitcher, but he became a Lubavitcher later in life. He was not born in a Lubavitcher family. He was born in the Carpathian Mountains.
So what was his name?
Steinmetz.
Steinmetz.
Yeah, it's my mother's father.
His first name?
Zvi Meir.
So his pen name was Zvi Yair.
So he wrote under the name Zvi Yair. He was very interesting, talking about someone who sort of incorporates tensions and opposites in his life. So he grew up in a Chassidish home, and not a Lubavitcher home. I don't even think they even heard of Lubavitch where they lived.
And when was this? This was before the war?
He was born in 1915. My grandfather.
So
he was actually born in Budapest. His family, they're not originally Hungarian. My grandmother, his wife, was from Debrecen. She was a true Hungarian. He lived in Budapest. My mother was actually born in Budapest, but he himself, his own family, came from. They probably didn't know most of the time even which country they lived in. They were in this small village in the Carpathian Mountains, which sometimes was Russia, sometimes was Ukraine, sometimes was Romania, sometimes it was Czechoslovakia. The borders were shifting so often then.
Right.
They actually lived not far from the boundary between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire. I think they were on the Russian side. I'm not even sure, but Jews lived in their own bubble, in their own universe over there.
It didn't really make a difference because all the goyim hated them anyway, so it wasn't...
Yeah. Well, interesting is the interesting thing is, by the way, that his family, his father and his sisters, he himself was actually saved by an Hungarian guy.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, this was during World War II?
World War II. He survived, him and his family, him and his wife, my grandmother... And my mother was actually born under Nazi occupation in
hiding
in Debrecen. No, before Hungarian Jews had a sort of a respite.
Right.
They only started rounding them up. Well, a lot of it started earlier. The men were. I mean, I don't know if we want to go into the whole history of World War II right now, but I'm just mentioning. You mentioned about the goyim hating them, but yeah, there was obviously a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe. But there were also many goyim, a minority, unfortunately, but many goyim who really, my mother, I am here today because of a woman, a Goyish woman, non-Jewish woman, who was a business associate of my grandfather's, who actually risked her life to save them. She took them into their own home. My mother was a baby. My grandmother was a young woman. She made up a story that she's an unwed mother and that she's working her as her maid. Wow. And she was literally at the risk. It was a few very close calls, and literally at the risk of her own life, saved them. And actually, they remained in touch very close after the war. I knew her. I met her many times as a child. She lived after the war. She lived in New Zealand, but she would come visit us every once in a while. She was like a second grandmother to me.
Wow.
It was very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So, anyways,
It's a bit of history.
yeah,
But
yeah,
anyway,
yeah,
so he was actually born in Budapest during World War One. His family were refugees from the war. The front arrived near their village and they ran away. And I guess his mother was pregnant at the time, so he was physically born in Budapest himself. But then, right after that, as soon as the war was over, they went back to their village.
And after World War II, where did he go with his wife?
After World War II, they were living in Vienna. First, they were living in Hungary. Then they managed to get out of Hungary, I believe, in 1948. There was a short period of time when the communists, either the communists were overthrown or there was a more liberal communist government for a short period of time that people were able to leave. They lived in Vienna for a number of years. In 1953, they came to America from Vienna. So my mother actually grew up in Vienna as a child.
And when did he become a Lubavitcher?
He became a Lubavitcher after he came to America.
Okay.
After he moved to America, he lived in Crown Heights.
Just randomly, he ended up in Crown Heights.
He had a brother-in-law who was also living. Well, a lot of people lived in Crown Heights,
right?
Not just Lubavitchers. Lubavitchers were actually a minority in Crown Heights in the 50s.
No, but I'm saying, why did he come to Crown Heights? It was just happened to be.
It was a Jewish. Like I said, his brother-in-law lived there already.
Right.
They lived on President Street, I think.
Right.
And he came to them. It's a whole story about how he ended up coming to America. He was actually unintentionally, wasn't even really intending to move to America.
Right.
Because he was doing very well in Vienna. In America, he was struggling for many years. That's a whole other story. The podcast isn't about his life. It's a fascinating life.
But it's important to set up the milieu that you grew up in.
So what happened basically was, you're asking how he came to Lubavitch, I guess is really your question here. So what happened was he was living in Crown Heights, and he had a connection. I don't know if it happened before or after, but he had a connection with Rabbi Jacobson, Rabbi Saul Jacobson, who was one of the leading figures even long before the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America. Right. Rabbi Jacobson was actually the shadchan of my parents. So that's another reason why I'm here. But anyway, so he was living in Crown Heights, and he was actually hired initially to be the principal of Beis Rivka when they opened up Beis Rivka with 4 or 5 children in Beis Rivka.
Really?
Yeah.
He had a history as an educator, or it was just
he was a big intellectual. He was
right.
So when he was in America, he was working. What happened was, he said, we're not talking about his life story. Then to answer your question, we're ending up giving you his whole life story. But what happened was, they came from a very wealthy family.
It's not your fault that you have an interesting grandfather. Yeah, anyway. What am I supposed to do?
So he was definitely a very big influence in my life, especially when it comes to writing and literature and the interest in writing and the fascination with writing.
So let me ask you,
let me just right. I'll tell you quickly the story. What happened was the family originally was a very wealthy family. Right. His father was like what you would call the Gvir of the shtetl. Like everyone in that little town worked for his father. His father had a lumber business. He would lease, and he owned huge tracts of forest, and they would cut down logs and float them down to the river. And all the goyim in the town and all the Jews in the town, they all worked for him. And actually, at the end of the day, that's what also saved his life, because he treated his workers very fairly. Unlike the prototype of the exploitive capitalist or whatever. He had all these people, the villagers, working for him, but he treated them very fairly. And then when the Nazis came, they were hiding out in the forest, literally in a dugout on the ground in the forest. And everyone in the town knew where they were. A lot of people in the town knew where they were. They would bring them food there. They would not have been able to survive that way. And they protected him. Nobody told the Nazis where they were. And the reason for it was, they said, this man provided us a livelihood all these years. We're not going to betray him. So that was another interesting story about how he survived. But he was a very wealthy man. And after the war, they reestablished it. Then of course, the Hungarian government became communist, and they nationalized everything, all their property. They were left with nothing. But then they reestablished themselves in Vienna, and they were quite successful.
As a businessman.
As a businessman. And my grandfather also was a businessman in Vienna, and he was very successful. He was doing very well. And just by chance, what happened was, he had a brother-in-law in America, and his brother-in-law told him, it would be worth your while. I can send you an invitation, a sponsorship, and come to America and get yourself a green card. And it can't hurt, a Jew in the years after the Holocaust to have another insurance policy in their pocket. To have American citizenship or American green card was obviously a huge thing. As some stateless Jew in Europe would have would be very valuable for him. So they came to America, and the original plan was to stay in America a short while, get the green card, but the minute they came to America, he enrolled. He had 3 daughters. My mother is the youngest of 3 sisters. He had 3 young daughters, age 8 to 14 or whatever it was, or 12, and he enrolled them in Beis Yaakov. And he suddenly saw, he said, this is Gan Eden. This is, my children have a Jewish education. And what did they have in Vienna? In Vienna, they had the most frummer people in Vienna had a 2-hour Talmud Torah after public school. That's all they had.
Right.
So he decided to stay, and he tried bringing over his business. That was not successful. He was left with nothing. And after that, it was a real Mesiras Nefesh, because he could have lived a very comfortable and very good life if he would have stayed in Vienna. And he struggled for many years. He actually had 3 jobs, 3 teaching jobs. He was a big Talmud Chacham. And the only way he had of earning a living, he got a teaching job in a high school in Yeshiva Flatbush and in Oyel Moshe and a few other places. He actually worked 3 jobs. He would drive from one job to the other and pull over on the side of the road and sleep for half an hour, literally like that. And then my grandmother was taking sewing in the house. They had many years of a lot of really hardship, real financial hardship and struggle. So at one point, they hired him to be the principal of Beis Rivka. He was not a Lubavitcher. He had no connection with Chassidus, but they needed someone, a professional educator.
He was a Fruma Yid at this point.
Yeah, he was a Fruma Yid. He was born a Fruma Yid, like I said.
Right.
He underwent in his life different, before the war, you see pictures of him before the war. He has a beard with payas and the streimel and everything. After the war, during the war, the beard, of course, didn't stay. He was hiding under assumed identity as a guy.
Right.
And it took many years for the beard to come back. Eventually it came back after he became a Lubavitcher. But essentially, they needed an educator, and they also thought if they'll bring someone from, they didn't really have, probably didn't have anyone in Lubavitch who was capable of running a school at the time. And also, they thought if they bring a guy from the outside, the whole Beis Rivka then was 4 or 6 or 8 students. I don't know. It was a joke. And they thought if they hire him as a principal, he'll bring in, non-Lubavitchers as well into the school.
Right.
They wanted to expand the school. Then the only from school in New York then was basically for girls was Beis Yaakov. And Beis Yaakov was an established school, and they were trying to build it up. So Rabbi Jacobson hired him to be the principal of Yesivka. And of course, the Rebbe had to approve it. So he went into the Rebbe. He had his first Yechidus with the Rebbe. And he, like this whole world, it was basically when he first met the Rebbe, he told me this is like what he was looking for his whole life. Literally, because his whole life he was torn between these 2 worlds. He was torn between his Hasidic upbringing and between the intellectual world of the more intellectual, side of Judaism. As a matter of fact, the first book of poetry that he wrote a book of poetry called Gesharim. It's a very interesting book because there were actually a number of doctorates written on this book of poetry. What's unique about it, it was published in Debrecen in 1942 under Nazi occupation, under the Nazi government, not Nazi occupation.
In Hebrew.
Literally, in Hebrew.
Why did he know Hebrew at that point? It was modern Hebrew, I assume.
Well, his Hebrew was modern Hebrew, but
Saying he was a Zionist?
I guess you can call him a Zionist. He was a lover of language,
Okay.
and he fell in love with the Hebrew language as a young child.
Right, but you had to be a pretty big idealist at that time to learn it because the country wasn't even established yet.
Right.
So it was a
there were all these groups, and there were
Zionist
these
groups.
salons. Well, not only literary groups
that spoke Hebrew.
that would get together, Hebrew intellectuals, Yiddish intellectuals, all different kinds of
Well,
intellectuals.
Yiddish I know, but Hebrew wasn't
Hebrew,
a Zionist
yes.
thing at that time?
It was, obviously it was Zionist,
Right,
but I'm
right.
saying a lot of,
It was more out of intellectual pursuits.
People
than,
today tend to say, Zionist or anti-Zionist. There was a whole spectrum in between.
more complicated. Yeah.
It's much more complicated than that, yes. And
He was more
definitely-
intellectually interested than politically interested, is what you're saying.
Probably. It wasn't even intellectual. It was more literary side of it.
He loves language.
He just loved language. He loved literature. He fell in love with Tanakh. He was a person who, from a young age, you can start any pasuk in Tanakh and he would finish it for you.
Really?
Literally. He knew
Wow.
the whole Tanakh in his mind. And he actually wrote a Hebrew later when he published his poetry. A lot of reviewers and critics in Israel who wrote about his poetry were like amazed. Where does this person who grew up, in Hungary, who lives in New York, never, he visited Israel a few times, but never actually lived in Israel. and he's writing like this classic poetry. It was actually because he didn't live in Israel. He didn't have all the modern Hebrew feel to it. It felt like like Yehuda Levi's poetry or Abraham Givurol, the classic Hebrew poetry. That's this pure Hebrew.
Wow.
That's coming from Chazal and from Makarius and from Gemara and whatever.
But take me back to the Chiddush, because that was such a fascinating point.
Yeah, so I started thinking about this book. So this book is actually the last book of Hebrew poetry published in Europe. Before the Holocaust and since.
Really?
And that's why there are actually, there are a number of people today, academics who've written dissertations, theses on his poetry. Because another fascinating feature of his poetry was that he was living first under the Nazi allies. The government of Hungary then was then allied with the Nazis. They were cooperating with the Nazis. They were sending Jews, doing everything the Nazis were trying to do, cooperating with them completely, and then ultimately under Nazi occupation itself. And he was writing about the Holocaust and publishing about it and writing about what was going on and writing
as poems.
As poems, and writing about it in a veiled way.
Writing,
supposedly talking about all the persecutions of the Jewish people, of the Gzeres Tachvatat, or the pogroms that were earlier. But it was very clear to anyone reading it.
Where was it being published?
In Hungary.
Oh, so it wasn't going out of the country.
Well, it reached
during the war.
During the war, it reached in Europe. As a matter of fact, my grandfather heard that Jews in concentration camps had this poetry.
Really?
There's a poem that he wrote about the Holocaust that's actually engraved on the wall in Hungarian. There was a famous Hungarian poet who wasn't Jewish, but was someone who loved Jews and Judaism. What do you call him?
Philo-Semite?
Semi-Philo, whatever.
No, Philo-Semite.
Philo-Semite, and he translated this poem into Hungarian, and this poem is actually engraved on the wall of a synagogue in Hungary. You can go see it even today. Anyway, so why am I bringing up his poetry? Because you're talking about the two worlds. So the first book that he published in 1942 in Debrecen, the Book of Hebrew Poetry, the name of the book is Gesharim, which means bridges.
Sure. And
the first poem, the opening poem in the book, he's talking about how he's standing on a bridge and he has very dear and close friends on one side of the bridge that he has an amazing rapport with.
Right.
And that's like his roots, his Hasidic world is that. And then there's the people on the other side who are the more modern, intellectual, literary people that he was hanging out with in Pressburg, because he went there to get sort of like a secular education. And they're also very close for his heart. And how much it pains him that these two will never actually meet. Like he's stuck in the middle. He's like, in a way, bridging the gap.
Right.
So as a matter of fact, he actually developed a very close relationship with Dr. Yitzchak Breuer, because Dr. Breuer, who was a son-in-law of Sham Shofar Hirsch, was like the father of the Hirschian school at the time, which was very intellectual, which took the whole Yiddishkeit, the whole Judaism, and gave a very intellectual summarizing to it. And he loved that. He had correspondence with him. He actually only met him once. They spent a few hours together. He came as a young delegate to the Knessia Gedola in Marienbad when they had the huge convention of Agudas Yisrael. I think that was in 1939, maybe. I'm not sure when it was. In the 1930s sometimes, maybe earlier. And he met him then, and they spent many hours together. But that was just when they had a face-to-face meeting. But in terms, he saw him sort of like a teacher and a rebbe and a mentor.
Breuer or Samson Raphael Hirsch?
Breuer. Samson Raphael had passed away many years before. When
did he live?
He lived from 1808 to 1888.
Oh, okay. I thought he lived later.
No. So this is his son-in-law or his grandson, maybe.
Okay.
Dr. Yitzchak Breuer, who was like the leading thinker and the leading philosopher of that school of thought. And he felt very close to him. And he loved that whole intellectualization of Judaism, but it was missing the Chassidish Varmkeit, which
Right.
he came from his house. He would tell me how when his father, like I told you, his father had this lumber business they had these huge forests. They would go throughout the summer. Crews would go in and cut down the trees, and the trees were lying there in the forest, and then they had to wait for the snow. Because once the snow came, and the snow was deep enough, these were huge logs of trees, the snow was deep enough, they were able to drag the logs down the hill on the snow to the river, and there in the river they would tie them into rafts, and they would float them down. And if the snow was too late in coming, the rat started to log. The log started to rot.
Right.
So you're in trouble. So they would go running to the Rebbes and giving them pidyonis to daven for the snow, that there should be snow, so they should be able to slide their logs down the. So he describes this very Hasidic background. His father was also a big intellectual.
Right.
Like he hired tutors for him. That's how he learned all these languages. That's how he had a very broad education. So he was what you would call today, I guess, like the more modern Hasidic world. But back then, the whole Hasidic world was more diverse. It was a lot of different.
Isn't it fascinating how we like when you look at history, it gets flattened, and we're like that. That's how people were. They were all like this. But when you when you zoom
look
in,
at particular people,
when you zoom in, it's like you talk about your grandfather. It's like, wait a second.
What was he?
Yeah, he was kind of like he was like, you think because they were living in the 19th century or the 20th century, so their brain was turned off. Like they weren't thinking pretty much the same exact questions that you were. Like, how do I adjust to this new world?
Right.
Like, what do you think? Because they didn't have running water in their houses, their brains were less sophisticated than ours.
They probably had running water, but
okay. I mean,
no, actually, maybe not. They probably got water from the well in that little village.
Well, they certainly didn't have warm showers in their house, right? And they didn't have toilets, a lot of them, and so it's like we automatically assume that. Okay, so if they didn't take a shower every day, so then they weren't that smart, and it's like,
yeah, obviously.
It's like you don't get smart from the shower.
But getting back to your question about the Rebbe, so like what he told me later was that like when he met the Rebbe, suddenly he saw both these worlds in the same place,
and he saw that instantly.
Well,
at the first,
he had very long. First of all, he told me the first time he saw the Rebbe was actually not in that Yechidus. The first time he saw the Rebbe was he just happened to walk into 770 once for a mincha, and he saw the Rebbe walk in. This is in the 50s, in the mid 50s, probably 1955, 1954, something like that. And he was living in Crown Heights then, and he walked into 770 upstairs for mincha. And, and then everyone was, the Rebbe's coming in. The Rebbe was a young man then, black beard, young, tall, thin, slim, was a very, very dashing figure. And the Rebbe walks into the room, and the Rebbe stands very quietly in the corner and davens mincha. The Rebbe would daven,
right.
Barely moving, barely shaking. He says, well, this is a Rebbe. Like, he knows the Rebbes. They're making a whole show.
One second, he came to see the Rebbe, or he just came for a minyan?
No, he walked into daven. He knew this was Lubavitch.
It's another stibul. It's another stibul with the Rebbe, basically, in his view.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I don't know how he ended up there. He just happened to be there.
No, because it's hard sometimes for us to comprehend that, like, someone would walk into 770 the way that we would walk into the base medrash of Karlin or Visionitz, and it's like
this is 1950. The shul downstairs wasn't even built yet.
Yeah, and I'm saying he walked in his mind. There was a shtibel with a Rebbe. That's it.
And he was very, very taken. He told me right away. The first time he saw the Rebbe, he was very taken.
From that davening, no.
From that davening.
You said he was shocked. Like, is this a Rebbe?
No, he was impressed.
In an interesting way.
In a good way. He's saying this is a real person. This isn't a show. This isn't a guy, flying all over the place, yelling, screaming, jumping, clapping his hands. He was a smart man. He saw through the fakery. And as a matter of fact, I asked him once. I told you before that in Hungary, and by the way, most of the Jews in Hungary refused to believe or that what was really happening. First of all, you have to understand, there wasn't internet then, there wasn't TV then, there wasn't, news arrived, in very, very haphazard
It's much deeper
snippets.
than that. It's much deeper than that.
It was also a refusal to accept it, but
the whole world was falling apart.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, people are wondering, like, basically hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Hungary. There were 400,000 Jews in Hungary at the time, and 300,000 of them were killed in 6 months by the Nazis. And it started in 1944.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So you're talking about in 1939, the Nazis were already murdering Jews in Poland, and Auschwitz was already functioning. Functioning is what a horrible word. Starting in 1942 or 43. So there were refugees. There were people. My grandfather told me there were people who had jumped off the train, or even
people were saying what was happening,
or even managed to escape from Auschwitz.
Right. And
they would come running, and they would say, "Yidden, you gotta run anywhere, everywhere, do anything. They're killing us all."
Right.
And they looked at them like Nebuch, this guy lost his mind. He had tsaris. He had, they knew there were pogroms. They knew there were Jews killing Goyim killing Jews. That always happened, So this guy Nebuch, had his family killed by a bunch of Goyish hoodlums, and he lost his mind,
Right.
And so I asked my grandfather, but my grandfather's writing about it, and writing about it in very, very explicit terms. He's writing about the Holocaust. If you read his poetry, he's mamish writing about the Holocaust in very, very in coded language, but very, very.
Right.
And I asked him, how did you know? No one else, no one else is a big statement, but most people, the great majority of people, didn't believe or refused to believe or it just didn't add up in their minds that this is happening. What made you realize? And that's why he saved his family. Right away, started taking steps to hide himself and to try to. I asked him. He said, "I was a student of Jewish history. Right. I knew enough about Jewish history. I understood enough about what the Jewish people have gone through for thousands of years to see what was happening, to understand what was happening."
Right.
So, he was a person who saw through the BS. He was a person who was able to. So that was his first encounter with the Rebbe. I told you, was when he just
the mincha.
That mincha. He told me that where they lived, they never even heard of Chabad. They never even heard of Lubavitch.
Where they lived back in Europe.
In Europe, yeah. He said.
But in Kranitz, it also seems like he was there for a while and didn't.
Not for very long. It was pretty shortly after.
But
you probably couldn't live in.
But he said he came from Minyan. He wasn't looking to meet.
No, he wasn't looking to meet the Rebbe at that point. But I'm saying is, you probably couldn't live in Kranitz even in the mid 1950s without being aware of Lubavitch. There was a presence. There were a few other Rebbes. There was what was the other Rebbe? There was, I think, Belz was there, and there was the Majesty Rebbe. I mean, there were a few Rebbes living in Kranitz at the time. Kleisner Rebbe, I believe. But the bottom line is, he told me another interesting story. He told me that once, when he was still in Europe, he happened to be in a shul somewhere, and he saw Tanya on the table. Tanya. So he opened it up, and he started reading it. And this story, people who might know my grandfather will find this story hilarious, because later in his life he became Tanya was for him one of the most amazing books. He had a very close relationship with Rabbi Weinberg, and he gave shiurim in Tanya in many shuls throughout his life. He gave many hundreds of shiurim in Tanya, very in-depth shiurim in Tanya. For him, Tanya was like one of the most amazing, fascinating books he ever saw in his life. And for his whole life, he was crazy about Tanya. But he told me when he was a young guy, he was in a shul somewhere, he opened up the Tanya, he starts reading it. He didn't get past the first page. Tzaddik, Rosh, some pilpul. This is boring. Whatever. He closed it. He said, "The Alter Rebbe would have had a better editor, tongue in cheek, and would have started with the more juicy stuff. Then I would have saved me 40 years until I ended up in Lubavitch." Because I would have been taken right from the beginning.
Well, I mean, the first page of Tanya is a bit cryptic. Like is it really necessary to go through this whole pilpul before we jump into the deep end? Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm saying, if you would have started right away with Nefesh Lakiz, Nefesh Bahamas, you had to just one page you had to turn, but he didn't get that far. You open up a sefer, you pick it up from the table, you start reading it. Anyway, but you need at least a blurb, on the back of it. Right,
but isn't that so just typical of how life works, that it's almost we don't like to think about it because it so deeply undermines our concept of rationality. Because to realize that everything is about timing,
Everything's about timing.
Everything's
and
about timing.
coincidence. And,
No, and it's like yeah, I'm all thought through. It's like you married your wife because at the time that you met her and she met you, it made sense.
Right.
2 months earlier, 2 months later, all bets are off.
Of course.
And that's it goes for every big decision in your life, every big happening in your life. And like it's so interesting, especially in the context of Yiddishkeit and Emunah and or or identity, however you want to frame it. Like we're convinced that these things are like inevitable, right? Like this is just like this is how it needed to be. And it's like, yeah, no, I'm not denying Hashgacha Pratis and things like that, but Hashgacha Pratis
that is Hashgacha
but no,
Pratis.
Hashgacha Pratis is the Eibusher's cheshbon. I'm saying we think that it's all inevitable, like on our cheshbon. And it's like the first time he saw Tanya, he wasn't ready for it. Like he wasn't ready for it, and it wasn't talking to him. He needed this whole journey of surviving the war and building himself back up in Europe, and then coming to America and going through whatever metamorphosis he had there, and to finally appreciate something that he could have had 40 years earlier, but in a way he couldn't have it 40 years earlier.
Probably more like 30 would probably be more.
But I'm saying maybe in a way maybe he couldn't have had it 30 years earlier. Maybe he wasn't ready for it then. Maybe he wasn't looking for it then.
Obviously.
No, but what's a lesson? I'm not trying to like investigate your grandfather's life. It's more just such a fascinating insight about how like we think that for something to be true it has to be inevitable all the time. Like what do you mean? How does this child not buy into Tanya this moment?
Right.
And it's like patience.
Yeah, it wasn't.
The truth.
He wasn't ready. The world wasn't ready.
The truth is here. Sometimes people they need their time. Like, meaning it's not a critique or a denial or a diminishment of the truth to say that this person isn't ready for it right now, or it's not their time right now for this encounter.
Yeah, well,
we're not saying that it's less true by saying that a person may
everything.
right?
Everything is a matter of timing. I mean, even the Chet Tzedakah is a matter of timing. Wait another 3 hours, the whole human history would have been different.
Right.
So many things are a matter of timing. A little bit early, a little bit later, everything would have turned. Saying that the event doesn't even have to change. It just has to move in time, a few hours or a few days or a few years, and everything is different.
But I'm saying, like time really does a job on us. You're talking earlier about the calendar and the lunar calendar, the solar calendar. Time really does a job on us because it fragments our interaction with reality and our interaction with emes, right? So something that resonates with us in this moment doesn't resonate with us in the other moment. It's not a statement on the emes it's a statement on us living under the rule of time, right? And one moment is here, one moment is there, and you hear a story like this of a man who clearly journeyed, who clearly was a profound man, an incisive man, a man who saw so much and did so much, and like would anybody say, oh, he was too shallow back then, or no, it's just like or would anybody say that his not picking up Tanya shows that Tanya is nothing? No, later on he fell in love with it. Right. It's all a matter of timing.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. That's very true.
So I wanted to ask you, because I have a feeling that if I don't put the brakes on it, we're going to spend an hour and a half talking about your grandfather.
True. Yeah.
And maybe we should.
Yeah.
Maybe we should, but then the marketing team is going to be upset about the Chumash.
Okay.
So you grow up with your grandfather. Clearly, he was a very dominant figure in your life. You're clearly someone that was a model to you on many levels.
Well, he was definitely a very big influence in my life. And there's also the context, like I told you before, my grandfather had 3 daughters.
Right.
And, the European mindset, for all his broad-mindedness, he was also a product of his time. So, this thing is, a daughter, he loved his daughters, of course, and taught his daughters, but a son is a son. You're waiting for your son.
Right.
And his 2 older daughters went away on shlichus. All his 3 is, Rabbi Jacobson realized that he has to marry, he had 3 daughters, he has to marry them all off to Lubavitch's. That's the only way, he's going to keep him in Lubavitch. So his oldest daughter married Moshe Lazar, Bar Lazar's mother. And she went to shlichus to Italy. And the second daughter is married Chaim Yafi. They went ashlichus to Portland, Maine, which back then in the early 60s was almost like going to Italy.
Right.
An 8-hour drive with a station wagon.
And today is further than going to Italy?
Probably, yeah, to get there probably take you longer. So, and then I'm the oldest son of his youngest daughter, which was the only daughter that actually stayed home.
So you were like the son.
So I was like the son he never had, So
Right.
so I became like the focus of everything he would have done with a son if he would have had a son 20, 30, 25 years earlier.
So how did you deal with the fact that you're growing up in Crown Heights, which is primarily dominated in the Lubavitch community by Russian survivors and their kids and their grandkids? Generally speaking, not children or grandchildren of European intellectuals. Like, there aren't too many. I don't imagine there were too many classmates who had a similar figure.
Well, I didn't really think of my grandfather as a European intellectual. I mean, today, retrospect, you're talking about putting people in boxes. You would put him in that box.
No, but I'm not.
But I'll tell you,
my question is more: you were around a person who's very different.
Right.
So,
But
so
I'll tell you,
not that you were thinking that he's
but
European intellectual.
I'll debunk a little some misconception of yours.
Okay.
When I was growing up, I would not categorize Crown Heights as what you said, dominated by. What's called like the Gezha or the Russian Lubavitchers were maybe 50% of Lubavitch.
Really?
Not even. Like in my class, I would say half the kids in the class came from all different kinds of backgrounds.
What's that? One second.
So it's and it was actually it was a small class. I mean, my class growing up in Ontario will sound crazy to you guys, but it was like 13 or 15 kids was the whole. And then there were maybe another 10, 15 in Ocean Parkway, and that was the whole Lubavitch when I was growing up in the early 70s. So, the whole Crown Heights Lubavitch, and then you had, of course, in Israel, you had here and there, but it was very small. Everything was very small. Crown Heights was small. Crown Heights was a few hundred families, maybe.
You're talking about the Lubavitch part of Crown Heights?
I'm talking about, well, when I was growing up, it was already
Mainly
either
Lubavitch.
Lubavitch or blacks. That's all there was in
Right.
Crown Heights left. Everyone had run away by then.
Right.
By the late 60s, everyone had fled to Crown
So
Heights.
50% of the remaining Yidden who were
Of the
Lubavitchers,
Lubavitchers. There were a few.
sprinkles, but
There
it was mainly
were
Lubavitchers.
a few, what they call the Sheris Plata. Yeah,
Right,
I
but-
actually grew up very interesting. I grew up on Lefferts Avenue between Kingston and Albany, which was sort of like an enclave. We were actually, Lubavitchers on that block were actually the minority.
Interesting.
The Sternbergs and the Gararis lived there. They still do, I believe.
Duchman also, no?
Dochman came much later.
So
Dochman, Shem Tov.
Anyway,
Shem Tov was
Mendel Shem Tov, my
Mendel Shem
grandpa.
Tov. Mendel Shem Tov was my next door neighbor. Our
Oh,
houses
okay.
were joined to each other. But so what I was saying, there were in that block, there were maybe 10, 12 Jewish families, and more than half of them were not Lubavitch at all. So that was actually an enclave of the Renbent of non-Lubavitch Crown Heights. My closest friends growing up in the block were not Lubavitchers. But even in Crown Heights itself, or let's say in my class in Holy Torah, I would say maybe half of the class were what you would call the Russians, the Russian roots.
And the other half?
The other half were a mix. Were a mix of what today you would call Zugerkubener, or people whose parents.
So you didn't feel out of place?
No, not at all. I mean, it was, there was the good-natured ribbing between the Gezhas and the not Gezhas, and we would fight. Are there more Gezha or less Gezha?
But nothing more than typical boys being boys. Like, there wasn't a deep kind of
No, there wasn't
complex
there
of any
wasn't-
kind.
No, not at all. I did not feel as an outsider in Lubavitch at all.
Did you feel any kind of conflict or any kind of tension between, because the yeshivas, and you went to Altair, right?
Right.
Altair is Reb Michal Teitelbaum
Right.
and Reb Yosef Rosenfeld, but the ethos was Reb Michal Teitelbaum. That's Russia. That's hardcore Russia.
Yeah, but he wasn't really involved in the day.
Yeah, but he found the whole idea of Altair is Altair
Yeah, but most of the teachers,
no secular studies.
Yeah, but most of the teachers were I would say were not necessarily born and bred Lubavitch.
But my point is that was not the Yiddishkeit that your grandfather was a champion of.
Well, by the time I was born and I was growing up, my grandfather was very firmly in the world of Lubavitch. He considered himself a Lubavitcher, a full-fledged Lubavitcher.
So he was not enamored anymore with the world of intellectuals?
Of course he was. But
so that's what I'm saying.
It wasn't a contradiction. Today, I'm looking at... today I think we're living or even inside Chabad, is a much more polarized society. And what I mean by polarized is it's very, very exclusive, not exclusive, but exclusive of other it's like everything is very, very staunchly Chabad, Lubavitch, and anything that's not Lubavitch is either unknown or rejected. It wasn't the world that I grew up with, even in Olei Torah. Even in Olei Torah, it was not like, Lubavitch was much smaller then. You didn't have this attitude that if it's not Lubavitch, doesn't exist or it doesn't need to exist. You didn't have that attitude at all. There wasn't the ethos, there wasn't the sense that you got, in yeshiva or growing up. I mean, we were Lubavitchers, It was the usual us and them kind of thing, but it wasn't.
You're saying vis-a-vis outside Lubavitch?
Yeah. It was the divide was not as as pronounced, let's say.
And this is back when. This is back when.
You have to understand, my parents.
Which decade would you say this is in?
I was born in 1965.
So we're talking about the 70s.
We're talking about the early 70s. I started first grade in 1971. 1971.
So you feel that in the 70s there wasn't such a divide?
My parents' generation, right? So my parents were Lubavitchers, and all their friends were, the people, like I said, the only people living in Crown Heights were Lubavitchers. But I would say at least 50% of the people of my parents' generation, if one was a Lubavitcher, the other member of my mother went. My grandfather's stint as principal of Beis Mikveh didn't last very long. It lasted about 18 months. But the reason was they never paid him, and
something's never changed.
He needed to earn a living. And even when he took the job, he was being paid less as principal of Beis Mikveh. Officially, what he was going to be paid,
right,
officially on paper, was less than what he was getting as a part-time teacher in some yeshiva, some Talmud Torah in Brooklyn. Right. So, but he took it because he was very much they asked him very much to take the job, and he had this meeting with the Rebbe. He was very impressed by the Rebbe. But at a certain point, he just had to leave because he couldn't afford to work for nothing. So my mother. Went to school later. I mean, obviously, during that year and plus something that my grandfather was principal of Beis Mikveh, my mother went to Beis Mikveh because if he's the principal, of course, his daughter has to go to Beis Mikveh. Sure. But after that, she was in Beis Yaakov, and like half the shluchim of that generation were her classmates. Bessie Gorelick is maybe a little older than her, but they're all products of Beis Yaakov.
Right.
Esther Sternberg is my mother's classmate in Beis Yaakov.
Right.
So her class, half of her class, ended up marrying Lubavitchers, because who were the Fruma Jews?
Right.
In Brooklyn.
You're saying the idea of Lubavitchers only marrying Lubavitchers.
I want to make one more point. So half of her class married Lubavitchers, and among those couples, half of them ended up being Lubavitchers both, and half of them ended up being completely not Lubavitchers. There are plenty of Lubavitchers who ended up marrying. I know some of them from my parents' friends or my parents' generation. They ended up marrying non-Lubavitcher women, and these women were not interested in becoming part of Lubavitch and ended up being completely outside of Lubavitch. It was not.
Right.
This whole thing of Lubavitchers only marrying Lubavitchers, I'm sure Lubavitchers would have preferred to marry Lubavitchers. It wasn't possible. There was simply not enough people that marriageable age. You married, if there was a Fruma Jew available to marry, you married them. That's what there was.
Well, look, my sister just got married to a Satmar fellow.
Yeah, but by you, this is something like
as a Yitzman Klal.
As a Yitzman Klal.
I'm saying
over there. It was a Yitzman Klal for two Lubavitchers to marry each other was the Yitzman.
No, but I'm saying I remember when when it became public, or when I first found out about it, my first reaction was, yeah, okay, fine. I mean, like this was normal until 50 years ago, right?
Less than 50 years ago.
Well, it's the 70s.
Right.
The 70s is already 50 years ago.
Yes, it is. True.
Sorry to remind you.
Yeah, that's true. You're right.
So, I mean, it is interesting just the way you're kind of laying it out. You wonder how much of that polarization that you're talking about.
Listen, as the community grew,
but it's more than that.
It's not just Lubavitch. It happened in every community.
But it's not just
when you're small. Right. When you're very small, you can't afford to just exist in yourself.
Your own bubble. But it's more than that. It's also
you can't because to be a Fruma Yid in Brooklyn, even then, or what, I don't know, then the term Haredi probably didn't even exist yet, but what today would be called a Haredi Jew, in other words. You were such a minority in the first place, to start creating those divisions within yourself was not tenable.
Suicidal, yeah.
It wasn't practical.
Right.
It wasn't possible. It wasn't practical. You think Olei Torah in 1970 could have hired only Lubavitcher teachers? They wouldn't be able to fill. So obviously, everyone who came to work for Olei Torah sort of assumed. Like my grandfather, he came to work as Principal Rivka. He became a semi-Lubavitcher in the process.
I just wanted to point out, on top of all that's true across the board. On top of all that, Lubavitch had the extra situation where Crown Heights emptied out, right? So they were geographically isolated.
Okay.
And one wonders how much that compounded this isolation, right?
So even then, in the 70s, growing up, the thing about Lubavitchers were that they keep to themselves, they're isolationists,
right.
Opposed
so already
to
then,
Lubavitchers were, let's say, bad mouth, for lack of a better word, for this trait of theirs, that they're so, they're so what's the word, elitist or patriarchal, or they just they only know about Lubavitch, they only learn about Lubavitch, they only admire Lubavitch, parochial, right. They only the only tzaddik is the Rebbe, that kind of. My friends, my not Lubavitcher friends, would make fun of me that Lubavitchers are so close-minded.
You're in your own head.
You're in your own head. But if you. That reality it's all relative. It's all relative to how everyone else was. But I'm saying, if you want to compare Lubavitch then to Lubavitch today, you would think of Lubavitch as being completely open-ended, because there's so many other.
So interesting.
Yeah. So I would definitely not say that I was an outlier. Obviously the core of Chabad was the Russian Lubavitchers, but there was an equal number, at least, of Lubavitchers who came, like my parents, who grew up in other, Balei Tshuva also, but that started, a little bit later. There were already quite a few Balei Tshuva. Like, for example, my uncle, the one who married my grandfather's second daughter, was a Baal Tshuva, from Sheffield in England.
Jaffe,
yeah, Yaffe. Not Jaffe. Jaffe's a different family. They pronounce it Yaffe. It's written with a Y.
He has a son who lives in Boston?
Yeah. Shlomo Yaffe is his son.
So that's your cousin?
That's my cousin, yeah.
Okay.
Yossi Yaffe.
Okay.
It's a big family, a lot of them are in shlichus in all different places. Anyway, but you had Balei Tshuva too. Not
but
as
in
many.
the 70s, that was a small percentage, I would imagine.
There were quite a few already.
Really?
There were quite a few Balei Tshuva.
But
very few of my classmates, for example, Balei Tshuva were younger. Very few of my classmates, let's say, would be children of Balei Tshuva. But a very large percentage would be people who sort of joined Lubavitch, who fell into Lubavitch, either, like I said, because half of them were sort of mixed marriages, and either they ended up in Lubavitch, they ended up not in Lubavitch.
That's so interesting.
Or just people like, for example, my parents, both my parents. I was talking about my mother's father, but my father also, similar story, where he was born in Nitra, which is in the so-called Hungarian part of Slovakia, really. It's like the Hungarian, it's called Oberländers. Culturally, it's Hungarian, but it's not really Hungary. It's Slovakia. And that's where he was from. And he grew up in Williamsburg. He was also born during the Holocaust, and he also came as refugees after the Holocaust. With his mother's father died I'm actually named after my father's father. He died in the camps. But my grandmother, with 3 children, came to Williamsburg after the war. He grew up in Williamsburg, and he went, as a young bacher, he went to Niter Yeshiva, and then he ended up in Lubavitch. There were a lot of, there were a lot like that.
I mean, the whole thing, the whole yeshiva in Atvatsk was a bunch of Polisher, a lot of Amshenovers, and a lot of other Polisher bachrim. That was yeshiva that was available, and the big Rabbi Reichik and many others.
And in Europe, for example, in the parts of Europe that were under communism, in many places, people who cared enough to go to yeshiva and had Mesiras Nefesh to go to yeshiva, the only yeshivas that were still up in operation, basically, were the Chabad yeshivas. So,
I mean, when we think about it, if we really want to think about it, I mean, Lubavitch, there was a time where all the Lubavitchers were Tzugakkumeners, where
Yeah, you have three families that trace their way to the Alter Rebbe.
But even they had to come. So like there was
Alter Rebbe also had to come from
right.
somewhere.
So I'm saying
right?
he was a Litvak.
Alter
Right?
Rebbe was a Tzugakkumener.
Right. Gevarna compared to the Gebarna, like
yeah.
It's interesting because I mean this is not something unique to Lubavitch. This is true about any movement, any company really. There's always a tension between there's always a tension between the stage in which things are more in flux and more.
I'll tell you a funny story. I remember I must have been maybe in fourth grade or fifth grade. Maybe we were 10 years old, 11 years old, and we're sitting in a classroom, and there's like 12 or 15 of us, like I said, and we're having this argument about what's bigger in Lubavitch? Is it the Geshe or is it the Tzugakkumener? So we said, okay, let's count the people in our class. So we're making a list. Okay, who has more? So the Geshe came up with a list that the Geshe is bigger, and the Tzugakkumeners came up with a list where the Tzugakkumener was bigger. So it turns out they were counting the mixed marriages as Geshe, and we were counting. so I have a friend, Nachum Shapiro. He's the Shliach, and this is like Geshe Shapiro, Levitch Shapiro's son. Yeah,
in Sydney,
Levitch Shapiro's son. He tells us, yeah, we're like the reform, because we're a dying breed. We have to go by patrilineal descent too. We count everyone as part of us, otherwise we wouldn't be enough of us. So, but it was a very good-natured kind of joke, kidding around. But there wasn't. I
was
not conscious of some
But think about it, because today Kranites is like considered the bastion of Lubavitch. Like that's where it's like whatever you want to think about the different levels within Kranites, but like that's Lubavitch, right? And like there's the Lubavitcher who grew up in Kranites, surrounded by Lubavitchers, and the Lubavitcher who grew up in the out of town or Shlichus where there's not.
Right.
And like what you're talking about is that like Kranites just 50 years ago was itself a sort of melting pot, and was
definitely.
And there were people coming in from outside marrying in. There were people marrying out. Not out of the religion, but out of Lubavitch,
yeah, sure,
right? And their kids today have nothing to do besides being related,
right?
They're not Lubavitch in any meaning there was consequences. Like their descendants were not going to be Lubavitchers.
Well, some of them did end up in Lubavitch in the end.
But I'm saying there was
a lot of them that had one Lubavitcher parent that went to schools that were not Lubavitch.
A lot of them didn't. A lot of them
didn't. But a lot of them.
No, just to me, what's fascinating is just that it's so sometimes like comfortable to assume this kind of static quality where like this is what it is, it's not changing one way or another. And that's not the natural state of affairs. It's a very uncommon state of affairs, is my point.
Everything is in flux. Things are always
changing. But we make believe though that it's static, right? We make believe sometimes, or we want to make believe that it's static for whatever reason. And it's like
I don't know who this we is. I mean, I never saw anything aesthetic, really.
So where do I see this? Where do I see this as something not just inside my head? Well, I think today people would assume that their kid marrying out of Lubavitch is like a big issue, I suppose, or something very, very undesirable. And point taken, what you said earlier is that a lot of what happened then wasn't because they wanted their kids to marry out of Lubavitch. It was just a matter of necessity. There weren't enough people to make a shidduch for everybody. I understand that wasn't that they wanted it. Like they probably would have also preferred.
Probably the first preference would have been any Lubavitcher family. Probably their first preference would have been to make a shidduch with a Lubavitcher, but they just simply were not.
Right, but today we've fallen into such a kind of I feel there's this kind of assumption of like we're so walled off in our own minds that the idea that this wall is permeable is something that I think most people would find.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I think. Now, maybe I'm just projecting onto other people. Could be.
No.
There's always that risk.
No, you're probably expressing, like the reality that your generation grew up in. That's not the reality that I grew up in.
Right. Right. Well, that's why I find it so interesting. I'm not arguing with
Right,
you. I
right,
can't argue with how things were anyhow, even if I
right.
didn't like it. But
And you might talk to someone my age who might have had a different experience and
right,
might tell you, no, it was always this way. Maybe
right.
he's projecting backwards, or maybe you really did
Well,
see it differently.
you had a grandfather who was a Tzuggekummener, right, to Lubavitch.
Right.
You grew up in
Well,
a block,
both
right?
sides of my family were people who joined Lubavitch in both my parents joined Lubavitch. My mother became a Lubavitcher when her
So even
family.
more, you
When,
had both of your parents were Tzuggekummeners. Your grandfather was a Tzuggekummener. Your neighbors were, a lot of them were not Tzuggekummeners, they weren't Lubavitchers.
right.
So maybe you had a different experience to other Lubavitchers,
Right.
but it doesn't change the fact that that's what was going on.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? No, I don't think it burst anybody's bubbles or I don't think I don't think it does any violence to
Right.
any
Right.
concepts. And I just think it's worth pointing out that it's so what's a value of pointing it out? I say it in a very constructive way. I say because it just reinforces the need for people, and I know you don't want to talk about this so much, but it reinforces the need for people to ask themselves, what makes me a Lubavitcher, and why am I still here? Like the idea that I'm just here because I'm here and therefore I must be here forever, that goes against history and against human nature. People journey, people move around, people
Right.
change.
For sure,
And
people move
so
around.
you want to stay Lubavitch for the rest of your life and you want all your kids and grandkids there to be Lubavitchers, gesund to hate. But you can't expect that to happen on its own, is my point. It's not
Right.
it's not the natural state of affairs for things just to stay static. Things move.
Right.
And
Of
so
course.
if
Of
you want
course.
it to move in a direction, it better be concentrated, is my point. So anyway, I find it fascinating, but I would like to move it a little bit towards the Chumash
Yeah.
because
That's what we're talking about.
well, at this point that boat has
We've spent
sailed.
an hour talking about something else.
Okay, but the truth is, I mean, this is common in the podcasting space anyhow, but the Chumash everybody can buy.
Right.
This, what we're talking about here, is not in the Chumash. So the Chumash will let them buy,
Yeah.
but now I feel that they're going to appreciate what's in the Chumash a lot more. But I still want to talk about the Chumash and tie it in because I think it's very relevant. I'm not sensing here a conversation where there's a whole unrelated intro about your grandfather and your
Right.
upbringing, and then this Chumash, I don't see the connection. No, I very
Right.
much see the connection. I'd like to hear how
Right.
you see the
So
connection.
I'll go back to the question that we sort of got on a tangent and we sort of
Yeah.
schmooze. But it really
Folks, I just want to make it clear. His writing is very concise and clear. This is not how he writes. This is only how he talks.
but we sort of went down on a ramble. But you started off by asking a question like, what made me become a writer? And was it because I always
Right.
wanted to be a writer and I loved writing? I started telling you about how I used to read so much and
Right.
how I loved writing. And we started talking about my grandfather, and that's how we got into this whole long conversation. But the interesting thing one of the things I started telling you, if you want to rewind about an hour, is that I never really dreamed that I'll ever be a writer. And that's precisely because I loved literature so much and I really appreciated what good writing is. And I just thought to myself, I'll never be able to do something like this. And if I can't do something like this, I'm not even going to try.
Right.
So, if you spend your childhood reading world-class writers, like literally everything I can get my hand on, my grandfather had, talking about bringing up my grandfather again, but he had a house full of literature. He had all kinds of, whether it was German poetry or whether it was anything under the sun you can possibly imagine, anything that was written that had literary value, he was interested in. And it's funny because I don't even hear this. It's like...
I know, but the people listening to the podcast are going to hear it.
Okay.
Folks, this means that we've been here for an hour already.
Yeah, right. Anyway, so when you're such an avid reader and you're literally consuming dozens, if not more, books a week, and you appreciate what good writing is, you never dream that you yourself will be able to do it because it just seems so far, so out of reach.
Sure.
And I got into writing like every Lubavitcher gets into what they do as part of your life of being a Lubavitcher, and just by the fact, talking about happenstance of just being in a situation where something needed to be written, and I was the one who knew how to do it better than the others.
Sure.
Not that I knew how to do it. So whether it's writing camp songs in camp, or it's writing, the placards that needed for the Lag BaOmer parade. I remember it was probably my first serious writing job. I must have been around 17 years old, and they one of the Lag BaOmer parades, They had this amazing idea that instead of having, in addition to having the floats, they'll have all these displays on Kingston Avenue where they put all these different scenes from Jewish history or things like the Lamites Malachas and all these things. And they needed these large play cards, like in a museum that explained. So I remember I was asked to write it. I sat for 2 days and 2 nights probably and just writing. I probably have it still somewhere. I look at it, I cringe. So it sort of developed simply by doing it. And not really believing that I really have any capability to really do it, but just doing it by doing it like every Lubavitch who's trained. If you're an Indian, you got to do it. You do it.
So now that we've got the nivus out of the way, now that we've got the humility out of the way, let's talk.
No, but what I wanted to say was that on the way I had help from very, very talented editors who really had the patience to sort of play along with my fantasy that I'm actually writing something, and on the way, correct me and guide me, and it was just by doing it, really, just in the act of doing it, that the various things through the years that I worked on, that sort of developed the ability.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. In general, with any creative work, it's always fascinating to hear how someone, like, how did you believe that you could do this? And very often, I mean, sometimes there are people who they're geniuses at it, and so like at a young age already, they're it's very clear to them and to the world that they're good at it. But for everybody else, it's mostly like a decision of like, I'm going to do it because I have to, or because I need to, because I want to, and then kind of pressing along with it. But I'm not so. I mean, I have done some writing in my day. I make videos for a living, so I'm personally interested in that kind of stuff. But I feel for the sake of the podcast, I think it's more relevant to talk about the Chumash and the style with which you went, the decisions you made of how to incorporate the different Perushim, because I think it's very much connected to our conversation.
Okay, sure.
Right. So
I
mean, of course, the obvious connection is your grandfather was a writer, so you ended up becoming a writer. I see that as a connection, but I see it in terms of the person your grandfather was and the Lubavitch or Kranites you grew up in. You described to me when we were working on this project that you wanted this Chumash to give people a sense of not just the enormity of the Pirushim on Chumash, but the diversity, and not even just the diversity, but almost the interplay, like how you did. I think you emphasized to me time and time again, I don't want to tell people what to think. I want to tell people what's there and let them draw their own conclusions, which of course is a very hard task when you're trying to condense everything. And so how do you editorialize this massive amount of work without editorializing?
Well, this is not the word that I came up with, but other people have come up with this word to describe what I did here, and I think that it's very accurate. I've had a few people tell me when they ask me this question, the question I always get is, how do you decide which pieces to pick, which version to pick? What's your process? And a lot of people people who've read it and get it, so to speak, they ask me, So how does your curation process work? How do you curate?
Right.
And I think that's a more correct word than an editor. I'm more of a curator than an editor. Imagine a curator who's putting up an exhibit of a certain genre of artists. They're not editing the pictures, obviously. They're not. Let's say you want to have, the 19th century Impressionists, and you're going to make the exhibit of the century that's going to have. So obviously no one is going to take a classic painting, by Monet and start, making it fit and cutting it and trimming it and adding color to it or whatever it is. But how do you pick what to put? How do you pick where to put it? If I have 100 great artists that I want to represent and I can only put 1 or 2 pictures from each one, which picture will it be?
Right.
Which picture will it be that most represents who this person is, what this person accomplished, and where he sits in the context of everyone else.
Right.
So that's the curation process, which is as difficult and not more difficult than editing. Because editing, in a way, is easy because you have your vision, you know what you want the end message to be.
Right.
Okay, I won't mention Chumashim by name, but as you know, you can open certain well-known Chumashim, and they're bringing hundreds and hundreds of Perushim, but they have a certain vision of Yiddishkeit in mind, and they have a certain ideology, and kol hakavod lahem, like you say, it's their right. If they're falsifying or they're manipulating or they're doing things that are disingenuous is one thing, but it could be a very honest way of presenting a certain ideology and showing all these different supporting texts that lead you to that place, which is fine. I have no quarrel with that, but that's not the Chumash that I wanted to make, because that's not real learning. That's just, if you want to be nasty about it, you can call it being brainwashed. And if you want to be more kind about it, you can say being guided or being directed by a certain person to reach certain conclusions, which that guy could be a very smart person and have a very valid and valuable ideology that he's guiding you towards.
Right.
But that's not learning.
Right.
Learning is you pull books off the shelf and you expose yourself to a tremendous variety of different perspectives. And when we say Shivim Panim, the Torah says Shivim Panim the Torah. When the Torah says Elu Be'el Dirakim Chayim, these aren't empty slogans.
Right.
The Gemara means it.
Right.
The Gemara really believes that you can have two completely opposite approaches on the most fundamental things. You can have a machlekes in Gemara. Is life worthwhile or not? What could be more fun? Imagine a religion that asks, should God have created the world or shouldn't he have created the world?
Yeah.
Right? It's and that's why Judaism, you can't even call it a religion because it's so much beyond that. It's tackling the most fundamental questions of life and addressing these questions with answers that are 180 degrees opposed to each other, because once you follow each conclusion and you follow each pathway and you really appreciate the truth that exists in this answer and this answer, it's the culminative effect of having these two ideas. You're talking before the sun and the moon. You don't have to reconcile it. And sometimes you do. Sometimes you have these geniuses. The Rebbe was a genius like that, where he could take two completely opposite ideas and show how they're really saying the same thing, and how each one, not only are they really saying the same thing, but each one really reinforces and makes the opposite view even more true by adding this other element, this opposing element, the Ezer Kenegdai idea. So yes, that exists as well. But even if you don't get there, even if you remain like the sun and the moon, you don't reconcile. You remain with two very opposite perspectives. If you were to have only one of them, you'd only have half the picture.
Right.
And by having both. And that's what learning, real Torah learning really is. Real Torah learning is to whether you're learning Chumash or you're learning anything. But Chumash is, of course, the starting point for everything. That's where everything comes from there. Right. Everything, the whole Gemara, the whole Medrash, the whole Halacha, the whole Jewish philosophy, the whole Kabbalah, the whole Musar, the whole Chassidus, everything comes is traced back ultimately to the Chumash. So the way to learn Chumash is you have a pasuk, you have a story, you have a narrative, you have an idea, and the Medrash treats it one way, and this Sefer treats it that way, and this Sefer treats it that way, and this plurality of views, which are sometimes each one building on the other. They do all kinds of things. Sometimes one builds on the other. You have one parish, and this guy keeps on going with the one before him. 100 years earlier, Rashi said something, and then one of Rashi's grandchildren or one of the Talmidim of his Talmidim picks up on it and takes it another step. And then 100 years later, someone else comes along and develops the idea further. So you have that kind of thing, where you have ideas developing and being taken to all kinds of places. Sometimes you have contrasting, conflicting ideas. And sometimes you have two conflicting ideas and someone later comes in and reconciles them. And sometimes they just get developed. But the point is, you're taking it to completely different places. You're interpreting, okay, what does this mean halachically? What's the hira b'poel? What does it mean psychologically? What does it mean philosophically? All these different aspects of it, it's the totality of that gives you the what's called the swimming in the yam of the Talmud. You're swimming in this wisdom, in this divine wisdom, which is all coming from the Torah, but it's all about all these generations of Jews learning Torah and applying it and thinking, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean to me? How should this be applied? How do we reconcile this with that? And it's all that tremendous intellectual output that ends up with what we call Judaism, for lack of a better word. That's what Judaism is.
Right.
As a way of seeing the world, as a way of living your life. and to what I'm trying to do with the Chumash is to show you the what's the word you want to show the guts of it, how it works.
Right.
When you take someone into the engine room, when you take someone into behind the scenes, we you don't just see the puppet show, but you see the gears and levels that are moving the puppets around. You want to get the back end. You want to see the under.
You want to show them how the sausage is made.
Exactly. Yes.
Like when it comes to sausage, always the phrase is you don't want them to see how sausage is made. But what's beautiful about Torah and what's beautiful about what you're doing here in the Chumash is it's clear that you are confident in the back end of the process. Like, I don't have to hide anything from you.
Right.
Let the truth stand for itself. Let this process of Pirush al Torah and like you said, the different traditions and the different pathways, let them stand for themselves. I don't have to cover for them.
Right.
I'm going to show you how the sausage is made.
Right. So a lot of you raise another very interesting point, because a lot of people are worried. Okay, so how is this going to be understood?
Right.
What if someone takes it the wrong way? You know what? If someone takes you want to know something?
What if a teenager reads it and gets turned off? Yeah.
You want to know something? What's the biggest fear of some people who are writing books? Some Apikoris is going to read this and it's just going to confirm everything that he disagrees. You know what? Fine. If a Apikoris reads it and this reconfirms, so he'll understand better why he's against it. So I've educated him too. He understands his own opinion.
I think you could also answer that in general. Why does everyone have to suffer because one guy is going to be an idiot? Like what about the guy who's going to be inspired by it? But I don't want to get caught on.
But your point, the real point is what you said. If you believe in Torah and you believe this is the truth, you should be confident enough to believe that what's called a marketplace of ideas,
it will win.
It can fend for itself.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't need protected. It doesn't need to be sugar-coated. It doesn't need to and you know what happens? What happens when you go ahead and you take something in Torah, and this happens all the time, right? There's an idea in Torah, and you look around you, what the common wisdom is, what everyone thinks the truth is, and it's completely against it, right? So you want to make it fit. You know what's going to happen in another 20 years? People are going to say, "Yeah, Torah said this. It's so old-fashioned. That's so 2020s." My cousin Shlomo Yaffe has a beautiful example of this. He told me he found somewhere in some Reform tract that was written in the 1880s in America, when Reform was starting in America. And that's when Reform began mixed seating in shuls. The Orthodox shuls had the women up in the balcony, and they're writing about these primitive Orthodox Jews. Okay, why are the primitive Orthodox Jews? They leave their wives. They don't understand the necessity for women to have a true religious experience. So they leave the women in the spectators' balcony to fend for themselves. They're not important. But we, the more enlightened people, understand that the weaker sex, who's also weaker intellectually, needs the guidance of her husband standing next to her and supporting her in her spiritual quest. Yeah. So that's why they have to have the women sitting next to them. So someone reading that now, so that was the ultimate progressiveness back then. Yeah. And it's important that a woman have a true religious experience, and that she needs her husband to help her out with that, to support her in that.
It's fun to make fun of the reform. I mean, that's pretty much our favorite pastime. But when you go to chuppah and the shliach is explaining how the ksuba was the first document of women's rights or whatever, and trying to portray like Yiddishkeit as like the trailblazer of women's rights, while true to some extent. They're lucky that most people in the audience don't understand Aramaic.
Actually, that's an example. I'll tell you a funny story. I was in American in Montana, and there was this person who invited me as a young rabbinical student to an evening with a bunch of other families in his house, and we're going to talk about Judaism. And of course, that's the dream of American Shlichus. That's the ideal situation. Instead of running from house to house, here's a guy. Right? So I come there, and there's 20 Jews there in the room, men, women, a whole bunch of other people. And lo and behold, there's a Reform rabbi there too. Now, there was not a single Reform rabbi in the whole of Montana. I don't know where he found this guy. This guy was visiting her. And he pulled one on me, and this guy's 10, 15, 20 years older than me. I'm barely 20 years old, and now I'm debating this guy. Right. So, oh my God, what's going to happen? But it ended up being a really, I ended up wiping the floor with him simply because, not because I'm so smart, because he was so ignorant. He knew literally nothing. So, but one interesting thing was with this woman, this rabbi had married her. He used to come there visit once in a while. And this woman later walks over to me very proud, and she shows me her egalitarian ksuva. And she shows me her ksuva, and it's a ksuva that, specifies the duties that the husband has to the wife and the duties that the wife has to the husband, and it's so egalitarian, it's so equalizing. And I look at her and I say, they ripped you off. They completely ripped you off. You know what an Orthodox ksuva is? Orthodox ksuva is a list of the husband's obligations to the wife. The wife's obligations to the wife, zero. She owes him nothing. There is not a single word of the ksuva. She doesn't have to work for him. She doesn't have to be intimate with him. She doesn't have to do anything for him. She has zero obligations. Right. All the obligations are only the husband.
Right.
And suddenly they went ahead and they took away half your rights.
Yeah.
They cheated you.
I feel like talking about the Chumash, it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, is that so much today of our chinuch seems to be about keeping. If we think of, you mentioned the idea earlier of that you want people that open your Chumash to swim in the Yam of Torah, which is such a beautiful expression, because the ocean is open and dangerous, right? Swimming in the ocean is not swimming in a pool or even swimming in a river, right? And
dangerous in what way? If I'm going to use your analogy,
risky. It's not safe to go off swimming in the ocean. In general, swimming is always risky, but the ocean is the unknown.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
it's the unknown, right? The ocean.
Yeah, but what's the danger here? When you're swimming in the ocean, you can drown, right?
Oh,
so you're talking about the unknown. So if you're threatened by the unknown, then yes, it's dangerous.
Well, it's
if you're not threatened,
it's
by
expanse.
The unknown,
the expanse of it
right?
makes the risk of drowning.
If it's not threatening to you.
Well, if
you're saying this is Torah, and anything that's in Torah is I'm home with, even if it takes me to places that I didn't change my mind about something or something that I thought of yesterday differently. Is that dangerous?
So let me explain. It's not dangerous for you not to swim, right? So much, meaning on its own, you take a person and put them in the ocean. That's not a very safe situation. They got to know how to deal with it. So much education today seems to be about keeping our children dry. How do we protect them? How do we keep them dry? How do we keep them safe, right? And it's understandable because we live in a world that feels very new, feels very foreign in many ways.
But when didn't it?
Say there, but for whatever reason, and maybe they used to react this way too. I mean, a lot of takanas were made earlier than this generation.
You're talking about 50 years ago, me growing up, so the big threat was television. Kid is going to see television, and that's the end of it.
And a lot of people didn't have televisions. Yeah, so my point is that people always, let's say right now.
I'm interjecting here because I find it almost maybe because, like you're saying, you reminded me how old you are, how old I am, and I find it sometimes amusing to people who've only gone through one generational change of thinking, wow, this shift from before the internet to after the internet or whatever.
I don't think that
there's never been a change like that.
I don't think that.
Right, I know you don't think that, but I'm saying.
I don't think
but
that. But
this time it's really different.
Yeah,
which is true because every time it really is different. Every time the change is completely different.
Tolstoy has a great passage on that in War and Peace about the fools that think that. This time it's really different.
Right.
This time it's really
different. No, but it is. Yeah. It is really different. But it's always been really different.
Right, exactly.
That never changed. So it's a quantum leap each time.
Right.
And yes, the change, definitely. I mean, the change before television to after television, let's say, is definitely a much, not as radical as the change before internet to after.
Yeah, but I think that's debatable.
But what's the common denominator is that they were both radical.
Right.
And they both were a bigger change than ever was before. So in that regard, nothing has changed.
Well, you're saying it's exponential. It's not linear.
Exponential.
Okay,
right,
fine,
exactly.
fine. But I don't think the point here is to debate whether or not the internet is as big a deal or not a big a deal. I don't know if they had a Sifis in City Field, about the TV like that.
Of that.
But whatever. My point is merely that when there are these changes happening, or when I guess always as these changes are happening, there is an impulse. I mean, in general, chinuch, going back to what we spoke about earlier, you either look at chinuch as upholding the static status quo, like this is how things are, or chinuch is passing on the torch to the new generation with the new circumstances in which they live, figuring out a way how to transmit what made sense to you in your reality to your kids who are growing up in a new reality. This is a question. But so when it comes to teaching or chinuch in general, it seems like so much emphasis is on, and maybe it was always this way, maybe it's no, that's not my point. My point is right now, there seems to be so much emphasis on keeping our kids dry. How do we keep them safe from the
But
threat?
it's not a new thing. That was always that way.
Say there.
When I was growing up, it was the same thing. Afraid they're
Say
gonna read
there.
Geisha books. They're gonna listen to radio, listen to TV. They're gonna go
Yeah,
off the
fair enough,
Right.
fair enough. But I feel like, especially today, where technology is so enmeshed in our lives, and trying to keep ourselves dry seems to become a failing battle, and more of a failing battle, like a flailing battle, where it's almost pathetic to watch. Like how do you?
Yeah, because you can't change.
Right, you can't just keep the TV out of your house. It's becoming harder and harder to envision how you keep yourself dry. How about we teach our kids to swim?
Right.
Right? How about we teach our kids to swim, and then they don't have to stay dry, right? So the idea here as well would be, in terms, because I'm not trying to give a exposition on chinuch. I'm not in that position, but it feels like when it comes to the Chumash, what's beautiful about how you presented it is, I'm not going to keep you dry from the ocean of Torah and give you a nice little packaged presentation where you can just walk home and be like, okay, no, I'm going to let you swim a little bit in the ocean. Get yourself wet. Figure it out. Figure out your depth, what you're comfortable with. And you know what? Maybe this book will lead you to more like this is just an entryway almost to like the because this is just a taste of what's out there.
Right.
But I want to get you wet. I want you to feel what it's like to be wet and to gain confidence in being able to swim. You're able to engage in this and take it on, right? I think
Look,
there's
I'm also not an expert on chinuch, but in my own
we're talking within the Chumash.
but I'm saying in my own, but you were talking about chinuch, so I'll address that.
Say there.
In my own very narrow experience of raising 3 daughters and living in having lived through.
So you really are like your grandfather, is what you're saying.
In that regard, yeah. I also have 3 daughters, but my grandfather would always say Rashi had 3 daughters. It was good enough for Rashi. It's good enough for me too. He would always faremfering the fact that the difference between me and him is that I never felt the need to faremfer the fact that I have 3 daughters.
Because you're modern, no.
Yeah. But
I also had 3 daughters until a few months ago.
Okay, there you are. So
Well,
you were in the club, and then you left the club.
When we first met, I had 3 daughters.
It's a very exclusive club. The Frierdiker Rebbe also had 3 daughters.
Right.
So anyway, it's an exclusive club. It's called the 3-daughter club. There's Rashi. There's Frierdiker Rebbe. There's my
I lost my
grandfather.
card.
Yeah. Well, Baruch Hashem.
Yeah.
You have as many children as you can. Each one is a bracha and a blessing. But what I wanted to say about chinuch is, and again, I'm not a machanech, and I don't have theories of chinuch, and I've never studied it, and I've never pontificated, but just lanias daiti, just my own small, narrow thing. The only thing, the most that you can hope to do, and it's a lot, okay? I'm saying the most you can hope to do, not in a way of diminishing what that is.
Right.
But if you try to do more, you're bound for failure. The most you can do is to give your children or your talmidim, if you're a machanech, to transmit to them in a very powerful and genuine, real way, your set of values.
Right.
Because you don't know the world that they're going to live in. You'll never know. Even if you're 25 years old and you're teaching a malamed somewhere, you're completely clueless.
Right.
I remember how we used to laugh at our mashpim and our teachers who thought they understand our world and they're relating. They're talking to us about the Yankees and the Mets. They're being cool. It was a joke. It was a joke. And I know that to my own children, I sound ridiculous when I try to make believe that I'm part of their world. Because I'm not.
Right.
I live in a different universe.
Right.
Let's face it.
Right.
So the only thing, the most, which is a lot, that you can hope to do is to give over in a very genuine, honest way. And if you don't live it yourself, forget about it. And if you have a certain value, but you're not living up to it, that's your problem. There's no way they're going to learn it from you if you're not living up to it. If you can't, you can't. That's it. You're limited as a human being, so you're limited to what you can give them. But to hand over to them in the most genuine, impassioned, honest way, your own set of values, how you see things, how you approach things, and also give them the tools to swim, like you're saying, to give them the tools to teach them how to be critical of something, to teach them how to process information, to teach them the tools that they should learn. And then you hope that they're going to take that set of values and they themselves will apply it with their skills to whatever world they face.
Right.
But they're using the bedrock. They're using that as the yesod.
Right.
They're using what you gave them, which you got from your teachers and your parents. They're using that as the foundation of how to actually deal with all the challenges and how to process everything that's going on around them and the world they live in. Because you don't know how to navigate the world that they're in. You don't.
And by the way,
nobody does.
And by the
nobody
way,
does.
by the way, your story of your grandfather is so illustrative here, because neither do they right now. They can't know. The same way that your grandfather took him 40 years to come to appreciate the Tanya, you can teach your kids all you want and all the tools that you're able to teach them, but they are not right now equipped to deal with the world the way they will be equipped in 40 years.
Right.
So it's an open-ended, constant journey. And the goal, in my view, is to give your kids the ability to constantly grow, and to constantly explore, and to constantly get better at swimming. To use that metaphor, like get better at swimming. We're confident that this ocean is swimmable. We're confident that if you learn how to swim this ocean,
if you believe that God created the world. If you believe that God created the world and He put us in it, and He wants us to deal with it, then whatever.
No reason for fatalism.
Whatever. No, I'm just saying, whatever tools there are available now, you can either use them or not use them. You can have people. You can have there's the bechira element. That's the open-ended part, and the bechira is not just your own bechira; it's the bechira of your parents and your teachers and what they did to you, and all the mistakes, their own mistakes. That we take our own mistakes and
shovel it onto them,
saddle it on our children, and every generation is basically suffering or impacted by everything that their predecessors did right and everything their predecessors did wrong. That's reality. You can't escape that. But just do the best with you can teach integrity. You can teach values. You can teach a person to be real, to be genuine, and you can transmit the things that you believe are the absolutes, the things that you believe are the bedrock truths. And either they'll accept some of them, they won't accept all of them. But if they accept most of them and build their own lives on that, then you've done your job.
Right. And what's beautiful about your Chumash, and we're coming up to this kisuf now, is that your Chumash, of course, being that you're a Lubavitcher and you spend so much time writing about the Rebbe Sichos and so on, it's very clear in your Chumash that that Chassidus plays a very elevated, if not dominant, role in both just being quoted in the general body of Pirushim, but also in the way you look at Pirushim. Every week you have an overview of the Parsha, and that's of course dominated by the Chassidic thought and of how we look at the stories of the Parshas and so on. But at the same time, it's not to the exclusion of everything that came before it.
Right.
Because it's all, to me, it all makes sense, especially the story that you've been telling all this time. Like Chassidus, the Rebbe said this in the Kunst and Torah Chassidus, right? Chassidus permeates the entire Torah. It's not to the exclusion of everything else. Like Chassidus gives you a person who learns Chassidus should be confident to learn any other pirush and every other pirush on the Torah, and not to be able to, I see Chassidus is better than this one.
Right.
No,
right.
I feel like open up a Likutei Sichos, see how many Sfarim are quoted there. How many Makaris? They would love these Sfarim, and that's it's in your Chumash. It comes through that loving Chassidus and being inspired by Chassidus inspires you to love everything else more and to appreciate it more.
But, it's funny that you say that because like you said, open up Likutei Sichos, see the tremendous variety of Pirushim that the Rebbe quotes.
Right.
But then there are people, and I've heard this from many people, that use that in the exact opposite of what you're saying, which basically says if the Rebbe quotes it in Likutei Sichos, that's a quotable source.
Right.
But so people tell, oh, you quote this guy? I don't think the Rebbe quotes him in Likutei Sichos anywhere. So that becomes the criteria. If the Rebbe quoted him in Likutei Sichos, then it's a kosher or valuable or a desirable.
I can
and if he didn't, then not.
Look,
You know?
I can understand. I can understand why someone would say that something quoted in the Kotasichas has a stempel that something that isn't quoted doesn't have. I can understand that. I don't know if I agree with it, but I can understand it. But I
Right.
mean, I think what I would like to just
So
bring out.
the Rebbe is your censorship
No,
committee. The
no,
Rebbe is
well,
the
I don't
one
know.
who goes through the whole Torah and
No,
decides what you should read
no,
and what you
no, no,
shouldn't
no.
read.
First of all, I'm not saying that's what I believe, but
Yeah.
I don't think that that's what everyone who says that means. I think, like, at the end of the day,
How do I know that this is a legitimate
no,
source?
it doesn't have to be that I know that's a legitimate source, but it has an extra. If I know that the Rebbe quoted it, it has an extra kind of. I mean,
Yeah, obviously.
It's more.
Obviously, it's fascinating to see
Yeah,
that it's meaningful and
but
fascinating to
say
see
there,
that the Rebbe quoted
but
it.
say there.
For sure.
All I'm saying though is, to me, what's more important, besides kind of the silliness that very often gets involved in this stuff. Like, I think it's just fascinating to see, and it's powerful to see in the Chumash that you put out, how, like, because it comes back to our original conversation, exclusive versus integrated, exclusive versus permeable, however you exactly translate it. Like, I see it also static versus dynamic. Like, these sources are talking to each other, right? Your grandfather,
Static is actually a very kind word.
right?
The
Stale is probably the right word.
some I'm not saying
I'm a kind guy.
static is a fine word because there's a much worse word that's sometimes applicable, not always, but the much worse kind of description that would describe some people's attitude, a very small minority, is fossilized.
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 Right. So I
So
mean,
you
I feel,
basically freeze
yeah.
everything. You know,
I,
there's this animal
yeah.
that lived so and so long ago, and here it's
I don't mind that.
fossilized. It's like it's immutable. It's set in stone now. It was a dynamic living thing,
Right.
and now it's
frozen.
like now it's frozen and not just frozen, but fossilized.
Yeah.
It's a stone now.
Right.
You know, if something's
I'm not-
frozen, you can still defrost
I'm
it.
right. Right. It's not defrostable. It's not defrostable.
It's not defrostable either.
I can't. I'm not negating that. I agree that that's a reality that we see sometimes. But I feel like fossilized describes the effect of what
Right.
happened. Static is the approach.
Yeah.
It's like we want to keep everything the same, but sameness, and again, I come back to the story of your grandfather. Like, what if we had frozen his life after he had closed Tanya after the first page? Would any Lubavitcher listening to that story say that's when we should have frozen life? Of course not. You would want to fast forward 40 years to when he opened
40
up the
years
time.
it's probably more like 25 or 30,
say there.
whatever.
Okay, so
Because
fast
you
forward.
keep on saying 40 years, it doesn't add up in the
I thought you said 40 years. Okay,
No,
fast
no,
forward.
I might have said it.
25 years is
like
still.
I'm saying, he was, when he came to Lubavitch, he probably was in his, let's see, if he was born in 1915, and this is...
Okay, let's remember he lived in a time before the digital time. So to
Right.
fast forward analog still takes a long time.
I'm
Okay,
just
so
saying,
to fast forward 25 years, everybody would want to move to that chapter. My
Right.
point is that you, like, this idea that you get to freeze it exactly when you want, when it's
Right.
convenient, makes no sense.
Right.
And so I think it comes down to that question, do we want to freeze things as they are because we feel that we've kind of accrued all the benefit we can and now it's all downside
Well,
to
we
let...
want to freeze things for very simple reasons. We want to freeze things because we know that was good.
Right, so
we think we know that was
we've
good.
accrued all the
and
benefit.
we're afraid of what might be lying out there.
Right.
It's either good or bad,
Right.
or probably bad, or maybe bad, or
Right.
most
It's deep pessimism. It's deep pessimism.
It's so let's be safe. It's about being safe.
Pessimism, and I feel like this Chumash, one of the reasons it's resonated with so many people, and within Lubavitch, I know also outside Lubavitch, one of the reasons it's resonated with so many people, it seems to me, besides of course the meticulous craft in it, which cannot be understated, like it's a big part of it. There's something about opening up a Chumash where literally every millimeter of the Chumash has been...
Every pixel is in place.
Every pixel has been argued about and fought over and like been redone and retouched, and every word has been thought through, and everything is there for a reason. The people who made it, believe me, I worked with them, both of them. They can defend every single part of the Chumash. You may agree with them, you may not agree with them, but everything has been thought through. There's nothing there that you're going to catch them like, oh, I didn't think of that. No, they thought of it, right? And so besides all of that, which cannot be discounted, at the end of the day, like Baruch kept on saying, This is a product. It has to be a product has to be beautiful. It cannot just be the idea. It has to be something tangible that works and makes sense in the person's hand and the way they interact with it. But on a more conceptual level, I think one of the reasons it's resonated with people is that there's clearly a confidence in that we don't need to be the gatekeepers. We don't need to protect.
It's not apologetic.
It's not apologetic. We are proud of what is out there. We want you to see how the sausage is made, right? The sausage is delicious,
and every top quality,
and every bit of it,
ingredients,
right, and every bit of it is great, and every bit of the process is great, and the more you get into it, the more confidence you will build, and the more you'll be able to swim in this ocean, and I think, maybe this wasn't a conversation of the typical Yutis Kislev type, but, what more beautiful way to think about Yutis Kislev and Erva Chayes Nafshenu and the idea of what's Erva Chayes Nafshenu on a simple level. I'm not a mashpia. I'm wearing a purple sweater here. All disclaimers aside, I would think that the simplest way to think of it is like just joy and energy and optimism and confidence.
And Judaism is something alive,
right?
Not something,
right, but not just trudging along, not surviving,
static or fossilized.
Like, right, you could have a nefesh that's just alive and just surviving. Erva Chayes means that nefesh is full of light, it's full of life, and its whole life is ahead of it. The light is on in the room; it's not dark. And one of those expressions, there are so many, of course. But one of the expressions of that is to open up a Chumash, open up a book, where the joy of Chassidus is evident, where the confidence in the message of Chassidus and Torah is evident. And yeah, folks, here's, for those watching on the video, this is a Chumash. It's a beautiful, beautiful Chumash. You should get your copy.
Take it out of the box.
Well, I don't know how much you're going to see on the camera anyway. But there's a Chumash. There's another piece to it. And anyway, I'm gonna put a link. I'm gonna put a link underneath YouTube to the video that shows the Chumash.
That shows it a lot more.
Yeah, but
exactly the way Baruch wanted to show it.
Right, exactly. Almost. The way I got him to agree to show it. Anyway, much love to Baruch. I know we poked a little bit of fun on this podcast,
that's the next interview.
No, he actually listens. By the way, he gives me his R's every once in a while. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but
so wave to Baruch.
Much love to Baruch. Baruch's a man. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a beautiful way to think about Yutis Kislev and to bring in Yutis Kislev. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate telling the story. And we all appreciate and thank you for this wonderful Chumash. And we look forward to the next four, Mirz Hashem.
Mirz Hashem. We're working on it full speed ahead. It's underway. And Mirz Hashem, over the next few years, we're going to complete the project.
All right. All those who said this wasn't going to happen, it happened. So now you know others are going to happen too.
Everything's going to happen, yeah.
All right.
Mirz Hashem. Listen, that's a whole other story, but there's a lesson that if you stick at something long enough, it happens in the end.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. A good Yom Tov.
A good Yom Tov, everyone. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
It's really been a pleasure talking to you. I know we ended up talking 3 times longer than we planned to, and saying about 10% of the things we wanted to talk about.
3 times longer than you planned to.
Oh yeah, how long did you plan this podcast to be?
About this amount.
Oh yeah, really? Okay.
Say there.
All right. So we spoke as long as you wanted to speak, but we covered maybe 10% of what we were going to talk about. But
no, we got what we needed.
All right. Okay.
All right. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentance Doors by Oren Sor Nadav Vachar and is used with their permission.